Grand Detour, Illinois, spring 1837. A farmer stops his team every 50 feet to scrape prairie soil from his plow blade because the sticky black earth clings to cast iron like wet cement. Eastern agricultural experts have reached a unanimous verdict: the prairie cannot be farmed. But a blacksmith with a broken sawmill blade is about to prove that the problem isn't the soil, it's the metal. The soil that refused to surrender. The American prairie stretched across the continent like an ocean of grass. Millions of acres of the richest soil on Earth, accumulated over thousands of years, untouched by human cultivation. It was exactly what a growing nation needed: more farmland to feed expanding cities, more crops to export, more wealth to build an industrial economy. But there was a problem that no amount of ambition could overcome. The prairie refused to be farmed. The soil was fundamentally different from anything Eastern farmers had encountered. In New England and the mid-Atlantic states, centuries of farming had broken down the soil structure. The ground was loose, sandy, easy to work. Plows designed for these conditions featured cast iron mold boards that turned the earth cleanly. These plows had fed the colonies and built the early republic. But prairie soil was alive in a way that Eastern soil was not. Millennia of prairie grass had created a dense mat of roots extending 6 feet deep. The topsoil was black, sticky, and impossibly rich. It contained more organic matter than Eastern farmers had ever seen. This was the foundation of future abundance. But first, it had to be conquered. The physics of the problem were brutal and simple. Cast iron plows could not cut through prairie sod without constant stopping. The sticky soil adhered to the mold board, building up in thick layers that stopped the plow's progress. Every few minutes, the farmer had to halt his team, climb down, and scrape the accumulated earth from the blade. Imagine trying to spread cold peanut butter with a rough wooden spoon. No matter how hard you push, it sticks in clumps rather than spreading smoothly. This was the prairie plow problem. The cast iron surface was too porous, too rough. The rich organic soil grabbed onto every microscopic imperfection and refused to release. The economic cost was staggering. A farmer might spend more time scraping his plow than actually plowing. An acre that should have taken a few hours consumed an entire day. The labor required made prairie farming economically impossible. You could not produce enough crop to justify the brutal effort of breaking the ground. Eastern agricultural authorities examined the problem with scientific rigor. They studied soil samples, tested different plow designs, and published papers in agricultural journals. Their conclusion was consistent and damning. The prairie was unsuitable for traditional agriculture. The soil was too different from Eastern conditions. Farmers should stick to proven lands, where proven methods worked. This expert consensus created a psychological barrier as formidable as the physical one. If the best minds in American agriculture declared the prairie unfarmable, who was anyone else to disagree? The vast interior of the continent would remain grazing land, its agricultural potential locked away by the limitations of existing technology. But the pressure for expansion was relentless. By the 1830s, Eastern farmland was becoming crowded and expensive. New immigrants arrived constantly, needing land to farm. The nation's manifest destiny demanded westward movement. The prairie had to be conquered. Farmers tried everything. They attempted wooden plows, but the abrasive soil wore them down to useless stubs within days. They experimented with different shapes and angles of cast iron mold boards, but the soil still stuck. Some farmers even tried polishing their plows to mirror smoothness before each use. The soil stuck anyway. The stopping and scraping became a grim ritual of prairie life. Farmers developed shoulder injuries from the constant climbing up and down. They lost precious planting days to the inefficiency. Some gave up entirely and returned east, defeated by dirt. The irony was maddening. Here was soil that could grow anything, that promised harvests beyond imagination. And it was imprisoned by its own richness. The very qualities that made it valuable, the organic content, the moisture retention, the dense structure, were the same qualities that made it impossible to plow. In agricultural colleges and experiment stations across the East, the consensus hardened. The prairie was a beautiful wasteland, fit for grazing cattle, but not for growing wheat. Any farmer foolish enough to attempt prairie cultivation would bankrupt himself in the effort. The cast iron plow had reached its limit. The frontier had found a wall it could not cross. This was the accepted reality in 1837. The prairie was unconquerable. The experts had spoken. The math did not work. Any solution would require completely rethinking the fundamental principles of plow design, and the Eastern agricultural establishment had no interest in such radical speculation. But in a small Illinois town, a blacksmith who had never attended agricultural college was about to ignore everything the experts said. The blacksmith's heresy. John Deere was not an agricultural scientist. He was not a wealthy inventor with capital and connections. He was a blacksmith who had moved from Vermont to Grand Detour, Illinois in 1836, following the frontier and hoping to build a modest living repairing tools and shoeing horses. He was 33 years old, supporting a family, and watching his neighbors struggle with a problem that seemed to have no solution. Every spring, the farmers around Grand Detour fought the same battle. Their cast iron plows, brought from the east or purchased from catalogs, failed in the prairie soil. They scraped, they cursed, they pleaded with Deere to somehow make their plows work better. Deere could sharpen plow blades. He could repair broken handles, but he could not change the fundamental nature of cast iron. The metal was porous, slightly rough at the microscopic level, perfect for eastern soils but disastrous in the prairie. No amount of blacksmith skill could alter that reality. Then he saw the broken sawmill blade. The exact moment is lost to history, but the impact is clear. Deere was working in his shop when he examined a discarded steel saw blade from the local sawmill. Steel was expensive, difficult to work, and rarely used for agricultural tools. But as Deere studied the blade, he noticed something that everyone else had overlooked. The surface was smooth, not just polished smooth, but fundamentally smooth at a molecular level that cast iron could never achieve. Steel's crystalline structure, formed through careful heating and cooling, created a surface that was harder and more uniform than cast iron. More importantly, it was slippery. Deere understood instinctively what the Eastern experts had missed. The problem was not the soil, the problem was the surface interaction between metal and earth. If you could create a blade that soil could not grab onto, a surface so smooth that the sticky prairie loam would slide right off, then the stopping and scraping would end. This was not scientific deduction. This was practical insight born from handling metal every day, understanding by touch and experience what laboratory analysis had missed. Steel might work where cast iron failed, not because of strength or sharpness, but because of smoothness. The challenge was formidable. Steel was expensive because it required sophisticated processing. Cast iron could be poured into molds, making it cheap to produce. Steel had to be heated, folded, and hammered. A labor-intensive process that made steel tools luxury items. Using steel for something as large as a plow blade was economically absurd. Deere did it anyway. Through the winter of 1836 to 1837, he worked in his shop designing a plow that violated every principle of cost-effective manufacturing. He shaped the steel blade with careful attention to the angle and curve, creating a mold board that would not just turn the soil, but allow it to slide cleanly away. The shape was crucial. Deere understood that a properly designed mold board did more than just push dirt aside. It created a rolling motion that turned the furrow completely over, exposing fresh earth while burying the cut sod. The curve had to be precise. Too steep and the plow would dig itself into the ground. Too shallow and it would skip across the surface. He borrowed principles from the best Eastern plow designs, but adapted them for the unique properties of steel. The blade's angle attacked the soil at the optimal point to slice through the root mat, while generating enough lift to turn the furrow. The smooth steel surface would, he hoped, prevent the buildup that destroyed cast iron plows. By spring 1837, Deere had completed his first steel plow. It looked different from traditional designs. The mold board had a distinctive curve, almost organic in its shape. The steel blade gleamed in the sunlight, an expensive gamble against conventional wisdom. The agricultural experts, had they known about this obscure blacksmith's experiment, would have dismissed it immediately. Steel was too expensive for plows. The design was untested. The entire concept was based on one man's hunch rather than systematic research. Deere took his plow to a farmer named Lewis Crandall. Crandall was skeptical, but desperate. His cast iron plow had spent more time being scraped than plowing. If this strange steel contraption could save even a few minutes per hour, it might be worth trying. They hitched the plow to Crandall's team and entered the field. Deere held his breath. Everything depended on whether his insight about steel's surface properties was correct. If the soil stuck to steel the same way it stuck to cast iron, he had wasted months of work and a considerable amount of money on expensive metal. Crandall started the team forward. The steel blade bit into the prairie sod, cutting through the dense root mat. The mold board turned the furrow cleanly, and the soil, that impossible, sticky, career-destroying prairie soil, slid off the blade like water off glass. Crandall did not stop at 50 feet. He did not stop at 100 feet. He plowed a complete furrow across the field without pausing once. The soil that had tormented him for years simply could not stick to the polished steel surface. The smooth molecular structure that Deere had intuited was performing exactly as he had hoped. When Crandall finally stopped, not because the plow had failed, but because he had reached the end of the field, he turned to Deere with an expression of stunned disbelief. They walked back to examine the furrow. It was clean, straight, and uniformly deep. The steel blade was still clean, unmarked by the buildup that would have stopped a cast iron plow a dozen times. The prairie had surrendered. A blacksmith with no formal training had solved the problem that defeated the Eastern agricultural establishment. The solution was not complex metallurgy or revolutionary design. It was simply using the right material for the job. The demonstration that silenced the experts. Word of Deere's plow spread through Grand Detour like a contagion. Lewis Crandall told his neighbors. Those neighbors watched Crandall plow without stopping and demanded to see the miracle for themselves. Within weeks, farmers were appearing at Deere's shop, begging to buy this impossible plow that actually worked in prairie soil. Deere faced an immediate problem. He had built one plow as an experiment. Now he needed to become a manufacturer. Steel remained expensive and difficult to obtain. His shop was equipped for repair work, not production. He had no capital for expansion and no experience running a manufacturing operation. But he understood something crucial about the moment. This was not just a better plow. This was the key that would unlock the prairie. Every farmer who tried the steel plow became an evangelist. The demand was not going to fade, it was going to explode. By the end of 1837, Deere had built 3 plows. By 1838, he had produced 10. These were not mass-produced items. Each plow was individually crafted, with Deere personally shaping the steel mold board to ensure the proper curve and surface finish. Quality control was absolute because reputation was everything. The farmers who bought these early plows became walking advertisements. Their fields were plowed faster, cleaner, and more efficiently than their neighbors. The difference was visible from a distance. While others struggled and scraped, Deere plow owners moved across their fields in smooth, continuous passes. Eastern agricultural experts began hearing reports of this Illinois blacksmith who claimed to have solved the prairie plow problem. Their response was predictably dismissive. Steel plows were economically impractical. The reports were likely exaggerated. Prairie farmers, desperate for solutions, were probably overlooking problems that would emerge over time. But the farmers were not exaggerating. They were underplaying. The Deere plow did not just work slightly better than cast iron. It worked in a completely different category. The comparison was not between a good plow and a better plow. It was between a tool that failed constantly and a tool that succeeded consistently. Deere refined his design based on field feedback. Farmers reported that the plow handled rocks differently than expected. Deere adjusted the blade angle. Some soil conditions caused slight drag. Deere experimented with different steel finishes. Each improvement was tested in real fields under real conditions by farmers who had spent years fighting the prairie. This iterative process created a plow that was not just functional, but optimized. Deere was not working from theory. He was working from ground truth, literally. Every modification was validated by actual use. The Eastern experts developed their recommendations in experimental plots. Deere developed his in the hands of working farmers. The production challenge remained severe. Steel supply was inconsistent. Deere initially used whatever steel he could find, including more broken sawmill blades, old leather cutting tools, and imported steel stock when available. The inconsistency meant that quality varied. Some plows performed better than others depending on the steel quality. By 1841, Deere was producing 40 plows per year. This was respectable for a small blacksmith shop, but nowhere near the demand. Farmers were waiting months for their plows. The backlog represented both opportunity and crisis. If Deere could not scale production, competitors would copy his design and flood the market. The breakthrough came when he established a reliable steel supply from England. British steelmakers had perfected techniques for producing uniform, high-quality steel at reasonable cost. By importing Sheffield steel, Deere could guarantee consistent performance across all his plows. This was expensive, but it established the Deere plow as a premium product worth the extra cost. More importantly, Deere made a decision that would define his business philosophy for the next century. He refused to compromise on quality to increase production. Every plow that left his shop met his personal standards. If the curve was slightly off or the surface finish was not perfect, the plow was reworked or scrapped. This obsessive quality control created customer loyalty that no marketing could buy. Farmers who bought a Deere plow knew it would work. They told other farmers. Those farmers saved money to buy Deere plows specifically, even when cheaper cast iron alternatives were available. The premium price became a signal of reliability. By 1842, Deere was producing 100 plows per year. By 1846, that number had jumped to 1,000. The exponential growth reflected not just increasing demand, but Deere's success in scaling production without sacrificing quality. He hired skilled workers, invested in better tools, and organized his shop for efficient manufacturing. The agricultural journals back east finally began grudging acknowledgement. Reports from prairie farmers could no longer be dismissed as frontier enthusiasm. The numbers were real. The Deere plow allowed farmers to break prairie sod at rates previously considered impossible. Fields that should have taken a week were being plowed in 2 days. The experts had been wrong. Not slightly wrong, not wrong in emphasis, but fundamentally wrong about the nature of the problem. They had assumed the prairie was unfarmable when the real issue was using the wrong tool. A blacksmith with practical experience had seen what they had missed. The prairie was surrendering, and America was about to gain a breadbasket. The prairie surrender. By 1850, something unprecedented was happening across the American Midwest. Land that Eastern experts had declared unfarmable just 15 years earlier was producing wheat harvests that dwarfed anything the eastern states could manage. The Deere plow had not just solved a technical problem, it had rewritten the economic geography of the nation. The numbers told the story in stark terms. In 1840, Illinois produced 2 million bushels of wheat. By 1850, that number had exploded to 9 million bushels. Iowa went from virtually no wheat production to 2 million bushels in the same decade. The prairie states were not just joining the agricultural economy, they were dominating it. This was not gradual change. This was a tidal wave. Farmland values in prairie states increased by factors of 10 or 20 in a single decade. Towns appeared where there had been only grass. Chicago transformed from a frontier outpost into a major commercial center. Its growth fueled entirely by the agricultural explosion happening in the surrounding territory. The Deere plow was the catalyst for all of it. Without the ability to efficiently break prairie sod, none of this expansion would have been possible. The plow did not just make prairie farming feasible, it made it profitable. Farmers could prepare more land in less time, plant larger acreages, and harvest enough crop to justify the effort. But Deere's success attracted competition. By 1850, at least 24 manufacturers were producing steel plows of various designs. Some copied Deere's moldboard curve directly. Others experimented with different angles and shapes. The patent system at the time was weak, and Deere spent considerable resources fighting imitators. The competition forced continuous innovation. Deere could not rest on his initial design. He developed improved models with features like adjustable blades for different soil conditions, reinforced frames for rocky ground, and lighter construction for easier handling. Each improvement was marketed aggressively to maintain market leadership. The Eastern agricultural establishment watched this transformation with mixed emotions. On one hand, the prairie boom was making America a global agricultural powerhouse. On the other hand, it was humiliating. The experts had been completely wrong. Their scientific analysis, their experimental data, their confident pronouncements about prairie limitations, all of it had been overturned by a frontier blacksmith. Some journals tried to save face by claiming the soil had changed, or that Deere had simply gotten lucky. Others grudgingly acknowledged that practical experience sometimes trumps theoretical knowledge. A few went further, publishing retrospective analyses of why steel worked where cast iron failed, explaining to readers principles that Deere had understood intuitively years earlier. The westward movement accelerated dramatically. Settlers who had been hesitant to risk prairie farming now rushed to claim land. The Homestead Act of 1862 would formalize this movement, but the practical foundation was already in place. The steel plow had made homesteading viable. By 1857, Deere had moved his operation to Moline, Illinois, where water power and railroad access allowed true industrial-scale production. The company was producing over 10,000 plows per year. The blacksmith shop had become a factory. The experimental innovation had become the industry standard. The prairie wheat flowing eastward changed American diets and American commerce. Cheap grain made bread affordable for urban workers. Mills in eastern cities processed prairie wheat by the millions of bushels. Exports to Europe established America as a reliable source of grain, creating diplomatic leverage and trade relationships that would shape international politics for decades. The cultural impact matched the economic transformation. The prairie farmer went from pitied failure to heroic pioneer. The image of the independent farmer taming the wilderness with his plow became central to American identity. That plow was almost always a Deere or one of its imitators. John Deere himself became wealthy, respected, and influential. But he remained focused on the practical work of improving his product. He never lost the blacksmith's mentality that quality and reliability were the only sustainable competitive advantages. This philosophy became embedded in the company culture and would carry the John Deere brand through over a century of agricultural evolution. The Civil War proved the strategic importance of prairie agriculture. The Union's ability to feed its armies while maintaining civilian food security came directly from prairie wheat production. The Confederacy, reliant on traditional Southern agriculture, could not match this advantage. The steel plow contributed to Union victory as surely as any rifle. By 1870, prairie agriculture had become so productive that America faced a new problem: overproduction. The land that experts declared unfarmable 20 years earlier was now producing so much grain that prices were collapsing. This abundance created its own economic and political challenges, but they were the problems of success rather than failure. The transformation was complete. The prairie, once viewed as an obstacle to agricultural expansion, had become America's greatest agricultural asset. The breadbasket that would feed the nation and much of the world existed because a blacksmith refused to accept that the problem was unsolvable. The experts had been wrong. The prairie was not unfarmable. It just needed the right tool. The breadbasket that fed the world. The John Deere steel plow did not just change American agriculture, it changed the course of history. The prairie states, unlocked by a polished steel blade, became the foundation of American economic and military power for the next century and beyond. By 1900, the United States was producing more wheat than any nation on Earth. The Great Plains, stretching from Texas to Montana, had become the most productive grain-growing region in human history. This abundance was built entirely on the foundation Deere had laid. Without the steel plow, none of it would have been possible. The numbers revealed the scale of transformation. In 1840, before the steel plow's widespread adoption, American wheat production totaled roughly 84 million bushels. By 1900, that figure had exploded to 522 million bushels. The prairie states accounted for the majority of this increase. Kansas alone produced more wheat than all of New England combined. This agricultural revolution created cascading economic effects. Railroad networks expanded to move prairie grain to eastern ports. Chicago grew from a village of 4,000 in 1840 to a metropolis of over 1 million by 1900. Its economy built on processing and shipping prairie wheat. Grain elevators, flour mills, and commodity exchanges emerged as new industries, all dependent on the continuous flow of prairie harvests. The strategic implications were profound. During World War I, American wheat exports sustained the Allied war effort. European agriculture, disrupted by combat, could not feed its populations. American prairie wheat filled the gap, preventing starvation and maintaining civilian morale. Between 1914 and 1919, the United States shipped over 180 million bushels of wheat to Allied nations. This agricultural power translated directly into diplomatic influence. Britain and France depended on American grain as much as they depended on American soldiers. The pattern repeated in World War II. America's ability to feed itself, its allies, and much of the post-war world came from prairie productivity. The Marshall Plan included massive grain shipments from American farms. The Cold War strategy of containing Soviet expansion relied partly on America's capacity to supply grain to developing nations, preventing them from falling into the Soviet sphere. When the Soviet Union itself faced harvest failures in the 1970s, it was American prairie wheat that prevented widespread famine. This geopolitical power originated in a blacksmith shop in 1837. The steel plow was not just an agricultural tool, it was a force multiplier that amplified American influence across the globe. The technological evolution continued. Deere's company remained at the forefront of agricultural innovation, developing mechanized plows, tractors, and eventually the complex precision farming equipment used today. The company that began with one man shaping steel in a frontier shop now employs tens of thousands and operates on 6 continents. But every advance built on the fundamental insight that prairie soil required different solutions than Eastern agricultural experts had imagined. The cultural legacy is equally significant. The image of American agriculture, the independent farmer working his own land with reliable equipment, traces directly to Deere's innovation. This archetype shaped American identity and political culture. The Homestead Act, the Granger movement, and the entire mythology of Western expansion depended on the practical reality that the prairie could be farmed. The family farm, whether or not it remained economically viable, became a powerful symbol because the steel plow had made it possible in the first place. Modern agriculture has moved far beyond the steel moldboard plow. GPS-guided tractors, no-till farming methods, and precision agriculture have revolutionized farming yet again. Satellites monitor crop health, drones apply fertilizer with millimeter precision, automated combines harvest fields without human operators. But the Great Plains remain the breadbasket they became in the 1850s. The land that experts declared unsuitable for cultivation now feeds hundreds of millions of people annually. The Deere Company, still headquartered in Illinois, is now a global corporation worth billions. But the green and yellow equipment still carries the name of a blacksmith who refused to accept expert consensus. The brand represents reliability because John Deere established that standard when he personally shaped every moldboard to ensure it met his quality requirements. That commitment to quality over expedience, to practical results over theoretical predictions, remains embedded in the company culture. The lesson from this story is not just about agricultural technology. It is about the relationship between practical knowledge and theoretical expertise. The Eastern agricultural establishment had the education, the resources, and the institutional backing. They studied the prairie problem systematically and reached a confident conclusion. They published papers. They conducted experiments. They built reputations on their analysis. They were completely wrong. John Deere had none of their advantages. He was a craftsman who understood metal and observed farmers struggling. He made an intuitive leap about surface properties that solved a problem the experts had declared unsolvable. His success came from experience rather than theory, from understanding materials through touch rather than analysis. He saw what the educated observers missed because he was looking at a different question. They asked whether the prairie could be farmed. He asked what tool would make it farmable. This pattern repeats throughout the history of innovation. The breakthrough often comes from outside the established system, from someone who approaches the problem differently because they lack the formal training that can limit imagination. The experts said it could not be done. The blacksmith did it anyway. The prairie that the experts mocked is now the breadbasket that feeds the world. The steel plow that seemed economically impractical became the foundation of a global agricultural empire. And the blacksmith who ignored conventional wisdom built a company that still bears his name nearly 2 centuries later. The prairie did not change. The soil remained exactly as rich and sticky as it had always been. What changed was the tool, and that change remade America. Want more stories about the innovations that conquered the impossible? Subscribe to see how other dismissed inventors prove the experts wrong and change the history in the process.